Hi, I'm Andrea Marshall, and thank you for attending my talk today entitled Zine Making as Autoethnographic Serious Leisure. Zines created in contemporary settings reflect the cultural practices that support a DIY do-it-yourself ethos and manifest as print and digital artifacts that resist construction as solely ephemeral objects. Harak has observed that, quote, the post-digital situation makes us reconsider the categories of new and old media and radically remix them, unquote. This is to think about zines functioning as rebellious artifacts, and that the act of making zines can engage processes that communicate radical ideas. Zines are hybrid media artifacts that demonstrate the attitudes and values of really rich and varied communities of practice. The act of making zines is counter-hegemonic demonstration of resistance to orthodox principles of indexing information and collecting data, since it is the pursuit of serious leisure. Mansourian emphasizes serious leisure as a cultural practice that promotes the agency of amateurs and information seeking in serious leisure, since, quote, people involved in various forms of SL are usually passionate about what they do, and it makes a big difference on the way they interact with information. They engage enthusiastically with the information they search for, find, and disseminate. Furthermore, as, quote, DIY is an amateur and participatory mode of engagement, unquote, as Watson and Bennett observe, zines constantly disrupt traditional categories of data, information, and art through the deployment of bricolage, or learning by doing, collage, and montage as embodied practices that are both adaptable and flexible. The open source tool, the Electric Zine Maker, promotes itself as a digital makerspace, a learning environment, and as a creative brainstorming tool. Digital zine making as DIY data creation and autoethnographic art curation asks questions about agency, identity, and community. Zines as grey literature perform as beatnik boundary objects and remixed data artifacts that invite debate with regard to their content and their creators. Grey literature supports the unconventional with regard to knowledge infrastructures as well as information ecosystems, and zines challenge us to better understand how the DIY ethos can be applied to alternative ways of knowing, to access and curate information, and to build data artifacts that can thrive in digital and analog environments that embody this ethos. Zines as beatnik boundary objects dismantle extant power structures through their surrealist critiques and bridging gaps between disparate ideologies through creating new dynamic ways of understanding privilege and agency. J. Brett has observed that, quote, zines are an ephemeral medium. As much as any generalization can be made about zines and zine culture, they are creative endeavors of a particular time, mindset, and sociocultural milieu, unquote. Zines as remixed data artifacts traverse the boundaries of the digital and the physical realms. In this way, their ephemeral nature demands that we reimagine binary oppositions between the digital and their physical realms through the pursuit of serious leisure. Zines promote the practice of bricolage, or learning by doing. Amateurs who collaborate with other amateurs to learn about the world around them and to build new understandings of the world around them can create new identities and new forms of expertise through the creation of zines. Jay Radway has observed that, quote, until zines emerged as digital forms, they were generally defined as handmade, non-commercial, a regularly issued, small-run paper publications circulated by individuals participating in alternative special interest committees. Zines exploded in popularity during the 1980s when punk music bands adopted the form as part of their do-it-yourself aesthetic and as an outside way to communicate amongst themselves about punk's defiant response to the commercialism of mainstream society, unquote. Zines as punk rock boundary objects in montaged and collaged representations of ideologies, mindsets, and philosophies defy linear constructions of identity and categories of power. Zines as punk rock boundary objects resist one mode of understanding and one way of thinking. Rather, those that create zines invite those who read them to become fellow collaborators and fellow active participants in making meaning and as part of a larger community of creativity and agency. A. McNutt remarks that, quote, zines are not a single monolithic genre. They are a medium which can contain countless narrative forms, unquote. This is because, as Davidson ponders, quote, zines, this cross a gap between life writing as a public act, a visual narrative performativity, via more formal modes of mass publication, while nonetheless still engaging in dialogues concerning personal experiences with a more selectively created collective, unquote. Zines are by their nature informal and amateur, and their creation, consumption, publication, and circulation all have roots in the practice of serious leisure. Radway comments on research about zines, how they function, how they are created, and how they are consumed lead to questions about more questions. She states, quote, indeed, the preoccupation with what zines do and how they do it has become central to the burgeoning literature on zines, a literature that has, in effect, created something that might usefully be termed zine studies and intellectual discourse about zines and zining that is not limited to the academic sphere, unquote. Zines bridge gaps by their very porous and informal montages of made meanings and collapse boundaries between privilege and resistance, as well as formal knowledge infrastructures and informal information ecosystems. The zines as serious leisure create informal expertise as a way to build communities, and zines as autoethnographic research create new information environments where the DIY ethos can really be shared and become more innovative with more participation. How do zines function as gray literature? M. Harak states that, quote, when speaking about the possibilities of printed matter, zines are the most experimental platform because they are easy to create and cheap to print. In media theory, zines are positioned in the alternative media paradigm, unquote. Gray literature contains adaptable and porous bodies of content in which preprint publications, secondary drafts, white papers, and other dynamic hybrid models of media exist. Zines as gray literature function as digital and analog artifacts that disrupt and defy linear categorizations and disrupt formal classifications. Zines are artifacts in motion, and the meanings they make are too in motion, changing and evolving with those who create them and those who consume them. Zines are artifacts in motion, and Harak furthers this notion by observing that, quote, zine communities are very material and intermaterial, as various materials and printing machines are involved in the production, and zine communities, therefore, are an assemblage of different bodies, spaces, objects, machines, and capital, unquote. These quote unquote different bodies, spaces, objects, machines, and capital, unquote, have all impacted the identities and the ideologies of those who create them and those who consume them. The creation of zines is an act of defiance, of creativity, and a statement of identity. The consumption of zines is an act of defiance, an act of creativity, and a discovery of identity, and a discovery of community as well. The feedback between those who create zines and those who consume zines as continuous and generative feedback loops manifest in these artifacts, and how they are perceived and received, circulated, remains in constant action. Because zines are artifacts that move, and the identities and ideologies that are associated with them are constantly in motion, evolving, shifting, and morphing, zines are social movements. Zines are social movements that reflect the pursuit of serious leisure. A core ethos of zines as social movements is the DIY perspective, the do-it-yourself perspective of creativity and information seeking revels in informal learning, playful experimentation, and the dismantling of power hierarchies that insist upon formalized modes of identity and information. Kuznetsov and Palos define DIY perspectives as, quote, "We define DIY as any creation, modification, or repair of objects without the act of paid professionals. We use the term amateur not as a reflection on the hobbyist skills, which are often quite advanced, but rather to emphasize that most of DIY culture is not motivated by commercial purposes," unquote. Watson and Bennett also observe that, quote, "One of the core aspects of zine culture is a DIY approach to practice," unquote. The DIY ethos that informs the creation of zines and the construction of zine communities has also infiltrated higher education research initiatives, as well as higher education research practices. Baker and Cantillon have remarked that, quote, "Zine making facilitates active participation and collaboration and offers a creative, affective, embodied way to contribute to research. Being amateur in style, zines do not require any specialist skills. There is no wrong way in terms of aesthetics to make a zine page with many forms of creative practice being appropriate and valuable," unquote. The amateur pursuit of creativity, identity, and communities in zine making and zine consumption demonstrates the power of serious leisure to generate bonds and remove boundaries. Juan Mansourian furthers this notion about serious leisure by saying that, quote, "SL participants passionately engage in SL activities, not to gain any profit from them, but just for the activity's own sake. SL activities typically need skills that participants develop over a long period of time. SL helps people to create new forms of identity linked to their roles and status in their community of interest by actively participating and engaging in cultural and social arenas and subcultures," unquote. Zines as autoethnographic data artifacts consistently resist and disrupt formalized linear categorizations and formalized classifications. How are zines autoethnographic data artifacts? Serious leisure provides reflexive potential for individuals to learn more about themselves, their interests, their communities, and the world around them. Zine making is participatory and collaborative, but it is also reflexive and internal. Identities are in movement and are constantly shifting, evolving, and morphing in zine cultures. Davidson has furthered this idea by observing that, quote, the zine artist's choice to not only refute the abstraction of limitations on creative production, but also to operate themselves under a pretense of anonymity and of secrecy, targeting the very technique of this expression of power. In doing so, zinesters reflect the ability to create a self-sufficient literary economy existing in parallel to the culture capital machine, unquote. Anonymity is agency. In zine communities and serious leisure dynamically shifts perspectives and anonymities as identities that are motivated by curiosity and playful experimentation. In the way that we perceive anonymity as a tool of autonomy, also means that this curiosity evolves and these identities evolve with the same creation and zine consumption as a collaboration that morphs basically into a dynamic movement, a dynamic social movement. Zine making really means that this reflexivity generates these really salient bonds between members of zine communities and disrupts boundaries that separate individuals from one another through shared autoethnographic awareness of themselves and others. Zine selves are in constant motion, and zines as a social movement is a shifting identity, a shifting perspective, and a continuous curiosity. Y. Mansourian furthers this notion by stating about serious leisure that, quote, as you can see, it is serious because they engage with their chosen activity for the long term, they learn new skills, and it can potentially form a new identity for them, unquote. Zine makers and readers are constantly investigating themselves, the world around them, and their fellow nonconformist playful amateurs. They learn by doing, by reading, by making, by reacting, and by connecting with one another. Furthermore, zine making as a serious leisure pursuit, as an autoethnographically reflexive participation and creation of data artifacts, art curation, and information infrastructures that have yet to be imagined, and new forms of understanding, learning, and new ways of knowing, is by its core a social movement. The DIY ethos is at the core of this social movement. And S. Juanerio speculates about the DIY perspective as, quote, once used as a means of indicating pockets of resistance to traditional forms of music and cultural production, DIY has now become synonymous with a broader ethos of lifestyle policy that unites people and networks of alternative and translocal cultural production, unquote. N. Stevens Griffin and N. Griffin have observed about autoethnography that, quote, autoethnography can be a means to amplify marginal or misrepresented voices or experiences, unquote. Zine making as a social movement and zine making as autoethnographic serious leisure continues to dismantle barricades between both physical and digital environments and create new identities, communities, and ways of connecting, ways of knowing, and identity curation and identity formation through information curation too. And this creative collaboration, informal learning, and reflexive self-actualization culminates in zine making as autoethnographic serious leisure as a social movement. The open source tool, the Electric Zine Maker, is at times an online makerspace and an invitation to experiment with artistic impulses, as well as a way to experiment with bridging gaps between digital and physical environments. Open source cultures support amateur interests that are collaborative and espouse innovative ways to adapt, remix, and reuse digital tools to explore creative identities and creative meaning making. BN has observed that DIY pursuits and autoethnography through creative making, quote, this kind of DIY autoethnography, besides being enjoyable, at least to myself, also has the advantage of being doubly productive. You manufacture lasting things with your hands, as well as produce ideas also with the help of your hands, unquote. Zine makers and zine consumers pursue creativity through zine making and zine reading as a social movement. These amateur identities that they occupy as collaborative and porous and shifting and disruptive. Meaning making is disruptive and creative, and they are resistant to formal power hierarchies and formalized information infrastructures as well. I strongly encourage you to try the electric zine maker. See what kind of meaning you can make, what kind of serious leisure you can pursue, what kind of autoethnographic conclusions you can share with others, and build communities together. Thank you for attending my talk. Have a wonderful day.